August 17, 1943, Vella Lavella Island, Solomon Islands. 0400 hours. The air hung thick with humidity as Platoon Sergeant Howard Jackson of the 16th Marine Defense Battalion crouched in the dense jungle undergrowth, his uniform already soaked through with sweat despite the pre-dawn darkness. Through gaps in the canopy, stars glittered in a sky that would soon lighten with the tropical sunrise. Jackson and his small reconnaissance team had spent 3 sleepless nights tracking Japanese communications across this godforsaken island, and they were certain the enemy had no idea they were being monitored. In just a few hours, the Japanese officers would discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption was. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a small group of Black American Marines, largely forgotten by history, became one of the most effective intelligence assets in the Pacific Theater by turning their academic backgrounds and linguistic skills into a weapon that would repeatedly shock Japanese military leadership and help turn the tide of several crucial battles. The story begins not in the Pacific, but in the halls of Howard University in Washington, D.C., where Howard Jackson had been studying linguistics before the war. The son of a Baptist minister from Louisiana and a schoolteacher mother who insisted on academic excellence, Jackson had shown remarkable aptitude for languages from an early age. By 22, he spoke fluent French and German and had begun studying Japanese, fascinated by its complex writing system and tonal subtleties. "My father believed that understanding another man's language was the first step to understanding his soul," Jackson wrote in a letter to his younger sister Marie in 1941. "Perhaps that's naive in wartime, but I still believe there's wisdom in it." When Pearl Harbor thrust America into war, Jackson, like thousands of other young black men, immediately volunteered for service. Despite his education and skills, the segregated military of 1942 offered limited opportunities for black servicemen. The Marine Corps, which had previously barred black Americans entirely, had only begun accepting them after Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, prohibiting ethnic and racial discrimination in the defense industry. Colonel James Thompson, a white intelligence officer with the Marine Corps who had spent 3 years as a military attaché in Tokyo during the 1930s, reviewed Jackson's application and recognized an opportunity. Thompson had been arguing unsuccessfully for months that the military needed more Japanese linguists and intelligence specialists. Conventional thinking among military leadership was that Japanese codes were too complex and culturally specific for Americans to crack effectively. Most of the brass believes the Japanese language is impenetrable to outsiders, Thompson noted in his personal journal. This cultural arrogance could be their undoing, if we're smart enough to exploit it. Thompson quietly began identifying other black recruits with linguistic abilities or academic backgrounds that might lend themselves to code work. Among them was Private First Class William Morris, a mathematics prodigy from Fisk University, Corporal Elijah Freeman, who had worked as a telegraph operator in Chicago, and Private Raymond Carter, whose father had been a missionary in Korea and who had grown up speaking Korean, a language that shares some structural similarities with Japanese. By March 1942, Thompson had assembled 14 men into what was officially designated as Special Communications Detachment B, though the unit was unofficially known as Thompson's Scholars among those few who knew of its existence. The men trained 16 hours a day at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, isolated from other units, and sworn to secrecy about their work. "They keep us separate from the white Marines, which suits our purposes fine," Carter wrote in a diary he kept hidden in his footlocker. "Less questions that way. The irony isn't lost on us. The same segregation that's meant to hold us back is giving us the privacy to become something they never expected." The training was brutal and intensive. Colonel Thompson brought in Ichiro Matsuda, a Japanese-American linguistics professor, who had been teaching at the University of California before being threatened with internment. Matsuda, bitter about the treatment of Japanese Americans, but still patriotic toward his country, agreed to help on the condition that Thompson would assist his family in avoiding the internment camps. These men have extraordinary minds. Matsuda noted in a report to Thompson after 3 months of training. Sergeant Jackson in particular has an ear for the language that I've rarely seen in any student. Their progress is remarkable, but more importantly, they're developing an intuitive understanding of how Japanese military minds communicate. This goes beyond language. It's about cultural psychology. By July 1942, the unit had mastered basic Japanese and was focusing specifically on military terminology, communication patterns, and code structures. They studied captured documents, practiced radio interceptions, and drilled on code patterns until they could recognize subtle variations in real time. The first real test came in November 1942, when Jackson and 3 others were secretly deployed to Guadalcanal, where Marines had been fighting since August. They were attached to a signals intelligence unit, but kept separate from the main force, operating from a camouflaged position half a mile behind the front lines. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, was initially skeptical when Thompson proposed including the special unit. "I don't have time for experiments, Colonel," he reportedly told Thompson during planning. "With respect, sir, this isn't an experiment," Thompson responded. "These men can give you information that could save hundreds of Marine lives." Vandergrift reluctantly agreed to a 2-week trial. If Jackson's team proved useful, they would stay. If not, they would be reassigned to standard duties appropriate for Black Marines, typically ammunition handling, cooking, or other support roles deemed suitable in the segregated military. On their 3rd night on Guadalcanal, positioned near the Japanese lines with modified radio equipment, Jackson's team intercepted communications suggesting an imminent night attack on Henderson Field. The Japanese officers, believing their communications secure, spoke openly about the planned infiltration routes. "They're coming through Sector 4, using the dry creek bed as cover," Jackson reported to Thompson, who immediately took the intelligence to Vandergrift's operations officer. The resulting ambush caught the Japanese force completely by surprise, resulting in 84 enemy casualties and only 3 wounded Marines. The next morning, Vandergrift personally visited the camouflaged listening post. "I don't care if you're purple with yellow stripes," the general reportedly told Jackson. "Your men just saved Marine lives. Keep doing what you're doing." For the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign, Jackson's team provided critical intelligence that helped American forces anticipate Japanese movements and tactics. By the time the Japanese evacuated their remaining forces from the island in February 1943, Vandergrift had requested additional linguist teams be trained and deployed throughout the Pacific Theater. Colonel Thompson returned to Camp Lejeune to expand the program, while Jackson and his original team were divided to seed new units. This expansion coincided with a strategic shift in the Pacific campaign, as Allied forces moved from defensive operations to an island-hopping offensive strategy aimed at establishing bases within striking distance of Japan itself. By mid-1943, several small teams of Black Marine linguists were operating across the Solomon Islands chain, providing tactical intelligence that repeatedly gave American forces an edge in the brutal jungle fighting. Yet their existence remained highly classified, not only because of the intelligence value, but also because the success of Black Marines in such specialized roles contradicted prevailing racial attitudes about the intellectual capabilities of African Americans. Lieutenant Commander Vernon Porter, a naval intelligence officer who worked with one of the teams on New Georgia, wrote in a confidential assessment, "These men are performing duties that require exceptional intellectual capacity and specialized training. Their success challenges fundamental assumptions about racial capabilities that many in command still hold. I suspect this is why their contributions remain so carefully guarded from public knowledge." The Japanese, meanwhile, began to realize something was wrong. Their operations were being anticipated with unsettling regularity, but they couldn't identify the source of the intelligence breach. Initial suspicions focused on their own communication equipment or potential spies within their ranks. Captain Hiroshi Watanabe of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Communications Division noted increasing concern in a report to his superiors in June 1943. "Enemy forces appear to have advanced knowledge of our movements in certain sectors, recommend immediate investigation of potential security compromises, and consideration of more complex encryption protocols. In response, Japanese units in the Solomon Islands began changing their code systems more frequently and implementing additional security measures. What they didn't change, however, was their fundamental assumption that Western minds, particularly those of supposedly inferior races, could not possibly comprehend the nuances of Japanese military communication. This cultural blind spot would prove catastrophic on Vella Lavella in August 1943, where our story began with Sergeant Jackson and his team hidden in the jungle undergrowth. The Japanese had established a significant base on Vella Lavella after being driven from New Georgia the previous month. The island served as an important link in their defensive perimeter, and they were determined to hold it against the expected American assault. Colonel Sadamu Miyazaki commanded approximately 600 soldiers on the island, along with naval personnel supporting barges that ferried supplies and reinforcements through the Solomon chain. Jackson's 5-man team had been inserted onto Vella Lavella 3 days before the main American landing was scheduled to begin. Their mission was to gather intelligence on Japanese positions, strength and intentions, information that would be crucial for the attacking forces. On that humid pre-dawn morning of August 17th, Jackson's team intercepted a flurry of communications between Japanese officers discussing the repositioning of artillery pieces to counter the expected American landing. They're moving their 75mm guns from the western ridgeline to cover the northern beaches, whispered Corporal Freeman, who was monitoring the radio. They're convinced we're coming in at dawn tomorrow through Barracoma. Jackson nodded thoughtfully. They're responding to the naval movements offshore. Good. That means they don't know about the southern approach. What the Japanese officers didn't realize was that the ships they'd spotted were a deliberate feint. The actual landing would come from the south, at a small cove that Japanese commanders had deemed too treacherous for large-scale amphibious operations. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Jackson's team picked up another transmission, this one directly from Colonel Miyazaki to his company commanders. The colonel was issuing specific deployment orders, confident that his communications were secure. Set up a perimeter defense with heaviest concentrations facing north and northwest, Miyazaki ordered. The Americans will come from that direction, as their ships have been spotted 15 kilometers offshore. They are predictable and will attempt a frontal assault where their naval guns can provide support. Private Carter, transcribing the transmission, looked up at Jackson with a grim smile. They're pulling forces from the south to reinforce the north, exactly what we wanted. Jackson nodded and turned to Private First Class Morris, who operated their own transmitter. Send the confirmation to command. Code Bluebird is confirmed. Japanese forces repositioning exactly as anticipated. Morris quickly encrypted the message and sent it to the American task force waiting offshore. The landings would proceed as planned, with the main force hitting the southern beaches, while a smaller diversionary force approached from the north to maintain the deception. What followed was one of the smoothest amphibious operations of the Solomon Islands campaign. While Japanese forces waited on the northern beaches, the 4th Marine Raider Battalion landed virtually unopposed in the south. By the time Miyazaki realized what was happening, Marines had established a secure beachhead and were pushing inland toward the Japanese headquarters. In the chaos that ensued, Jackson's team continued monitoring Japanese communications, providing real-time intelligence on enemy movements and counterattacks. The Japanese commanders, now aware they had been outmaneuvered, shifted to a more direct form of communication that revealed their growing frustration. How did they know to avoid our gun positions? One company commander demanded over the radio. The Americans should not have known about our deployment. There must be a traitor among us. Colonel Miyazaki's response was terse. Secure your communications. Switch to alternate encryption immediately. But the damage was done. The Japanese forces on Vella Lavella, caught off guard and improperly positioned, could not mount an effective defense. Within 3 days, organized resistance on the island had collapsed, with the remaining Japanese troops retreating into the jungle or evacuating by barge under cover of darkness. For Jackson and his team, however, the most revealing moment came during the confused Japanese retreat. As darkness fell on the 3rd day of fighting, They intercepted a conversation between Miyazaki and a naval officer coordinating the evacuation. "This is the third operation where Americans have anticipated our movements," the naval officer said. "We must consider that they may have broken some of our codes." "Impossible," Miyazaki replied firmly. "Our communication systems are based on cultural concepts no Westerner could comprehend. More likely, we have spies in our ranks, perhaps islanders working for the Americans." This exchange, which Jackson dutifully reported up the chain of command, revealed a critical vulnerability in Japanese military thinking. Their unshakable belief in their own cultural uniqueness and superiority prevented them from recognizing the true nature of the intelligence breach. Following the successful Vella Lavella operation, Jackson's team was extracted and briefly returned to Guadalcanal for debriefing. It was during this period that Colonel Thompson, who had returned to the Pacific to assess the program's effectiveness, recommended expanding their role beyond passive intelligence gathering. "These men have proven they can do more than just listen," Thompson argued in a meeting with Admiral William Halsey's staff. "They understand enough about Japanese communication patterns to actively disrupt and manipulate them." The proposal was to use the linguist teams not just for intelligence collection, but for tactical deception, actively transmitting false information designed to confuse and misdirect Japanese forces. This represented a significant escalation in their role and carried substantially higher risks, as active transmission increased the chances of discovery and capture. Despite the dangers, Jackson and his men volunteered for the expanded mission. By October 1943, they were preparing for their most ambitious operation yet, supporting the planned invasion of Bougainville, the largest island in the Solomon chain and a critical Japanese stronghold. For this mission, Jackson's team was augmented with 2 new members, Private Henry Wilson, a former amateur radio operator from Detroit, and Private First Class Nathan Brooks, who had studied electrical engineering before the war. Their technical skills would be crucial for the deception operations planned for Bougainville. The team was inserted onto a small island off the coast of Bougainville 2 weeks before the main invasion force was scheduled to arrive. From this forward position, they could monitor Japanese communications on the main island while remaining relatively secure from detection. "Our job this time isn't just to listen," Jackson briefed his team as they established their hidden position. "We're going to make them hear what we want them to hear." The plan was audacious. Using their understanding of Japanese military protocols, they would transmit false messages designed to convince the Japanese command that the main American landing would target the eastern coast of Bougainville, near the town of Quieta, where the Japanese had a significant airfield. In reality, the Allied forces would land on the western side of the island at Empress Augusta Bay. For 5 consecutive nights, Wilson and Brooks transmitted encrypted messages using captured Japanese equipment, mimicking the communication patterns of Japanese naval units. The messages, carefully crafted to seem authentic, suggested American task forces were assembling for an assault on Quieta. Meanwhile, Jackson, Freeman, and Carter continued monitoring genuine Japanese communications, assessing whether their deception was being accepted. The first indication of success came 3 days into the operation, when they intercepted orders from Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese forces on Bougainville, directing 2 infantry battalions to redeploy from the western coast to reinforce Quieta. "They're taking the bait," Freeman whispered excitedly as he translated the orders. "They're thinning out exactly where we plan to land." Jackson nodded, but his expression remained grim. "Keep listening. If they suddenly change their minds, we need to know immediately." As the date of the invasion approached, the team's activities grew increasingly dangerous. Japanese communication security had tightened, and there were worrying indications that the enemy was conducting radio direction-finding operations to locate unauthorized transmitters. On October 31st, just 2 days before the planned invasion, disaster nearly struck. A Japanese patrol boat was spotted approaching the small island where Jackson's team was hidden. Whether by chance or because they had detected the team's transmissions was unclear, but the threat was immediate. The Marines quickly dismantled their equipment and retreated to a pre-prepared hiding position deep in the island's interior. For 18 tense hours they remained motionless as Japanese sailors searched the shoreline. The patrol finally departed after finding nothing, but the close call forced a modification of their plans. They would need to relocate and reduce their transmission activities to avoid detection. Despite the setback, the team had already accomplished their primary objective. Japanese forces on Bougainville were now concentrated in the east, leaving the western beaches at Empress Augusta Bay vulnerable. On November 1, 1943, the 3rd Marine Division landed at Empress Augusta Bay, encountering only light resistance initially. The landing itself went smoothly, but the Japanese reaction was swift and violent once they realized they had been deceived. General Hyakutake immediately ordered his forces to counterattack, determined to drive the Americans back into the sea before they could establish a secure beachhead. From their hidden position, Jackson's team continued monitoring these frantic communications, providing invaluable intelligence to the Marine Command about the timing and direction of the coming counterattacks. This information allowed American forces to prepare defensive positions and call in naval gunfire support at critical moments. 3 days into the battle, as the fighting intensified around the American perimeter, the team intercepted a remarkable exchange between General Hyakutake and one of his staff officers. "How could our intelligence have been so wrong?" the staff officer asked. "We were certain they would land at Kieta." "We were manipulated," Hyakutake replied after a long pause. "The messages we intercepted about their intentions for Kieta, they must have been deliberate deception. But the communications followed all our protocols. They used our own codes." "Then we must consider the unthinkable," Hyakutake said gravely. "The Americans may have personnel who understand our language and codes far better than we believed possible." This realization came too late to change the outcome at Bougainville. The 3rd Marine Division successfully established and expanded their beachhead, and despite fierce Japanese counterattacks, the American position remained secure. The operation was another success for the Allied island-hopping strategy, and a personal triumph for Jackson and his team, whose deception had directly contributed to reducing American casualties. Following the Bougainville operation, Jackson's team was extracted and returned to Guadalcanal for debriefing. Their success had not gone unnoticed at higher levels of command, and there was discussion of expanding their role even further for the coming campaigns in the Mariana Islands. Yet despite their extraordinary contributions, the men of Thompson's Scholars remained largely unknown outside a small circle of intelligence officers and commanders. Their existence was classified, their missions unrecorded in official histories, and their achievements uncelebrated in the press accounts that glorified the Marine Corps' advances across the Pacific. For the Black Marines themselves, this invisibility carried a painful irony. They had repeatedly proven their exceptional capabilities in one of the war's most intellectually demanding roles, yet they remained subject to the same discrimination and limitations as other black servicemen. "We break their codes by day and eat at segregated mess halls by night," Private Carter wrote bitterly in his diary. "We warn of attacks that save white Marines' lives, then return to quarters where some of those same men would refuse to bunk near us." Colonel Thompson, to his credit, recognized this injustice and advocated persistently for recognition of his men's contributions. In December 1943, he submitted a detailed report to Marine Corps headquarters outlining the unit's achievements and recommending commendations for several team members, including Jackson. "These men have performed duties requiring the highest levels of intelligence, education, and courage," Thompson wrote. "Their contributions have directly saved hundreds of American lives and significantly advanced our progress in the Pacific Campaign. They deserve recognition comparable to that which would undoubtedly be granted to white Marines performing similar services." The response from headquarters was revealing. While acknowledging the value of the intelligence provided by the special units, senior officers expressed concern about the complexities of publicly recognizing the role of Black Marines in such sensitive operations. "Current policies regarding the appropriate utilization of colored personnel must be considered," wrote one staff officer in a memo that was later declassified. Public recognition of their service in roles typically reserved for white personnel could create difficulties for the established order of service segregation. Instead of the bronze stars that Thompson had recommended, Jackson and his men received letters of commendation that carefully obscured the nature of their actual contributions, describing their service only in vague terms as valuable technical assistance to combat operations. For Jackson, the lack of recognition was disappointing but not surprising. In a letter to his sister written in January 1944, he reflected on the paradox of his service. "We have proven what we already knew, that the color of a man's skin has nothing to do with the quality of his mind or the courage in his heart. Whether the Marine Corps chooses to acknowledge that truth is beyond my control, what matters is that we have served our country with honor and helped bring this terrible war closer to its end." As 1944 began, Jackson and his team prepared for new assignments in the Central Pacific Campaign. The battles for the Marshall Islands and then the Marianas would bring new challenges and opportunities to demonstrate their unique skills. The Japanese, meanwhile, were beginning to recognize the extent of their vulnerability, though their cultural pride still prevented them from fully accepting that their unbreakable codes were being routinely interpreted by the very men they considered racially inferior. This clash between prejudice and reality, both American and Japanese, would continue to shape the hidden intelligence war in the Pacific, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situations. For Howard Jackson and the other black Marines of the Special Linguist Units, the war was being fought on two fronts simultaneously, against the Japanese enemy abroad and against racial prejudice at home. As dawn broke fully over Bougainville on November 5, 1943, with American forces now firmly established ashore, Jackson stood on a hilltop overlooking the beachhead. Thousands of Marines bustled below, unloading supplies, establishing defensive positions, and preparing for the next phase of the campaign. None of them knew how 5 black Marines, hidden on a tiny island, had helped make their landing possible, had perhaps even saved many of their lives. "Do you ever wonder if they'll know what we did here?" asked Private Carter, who had climbed the hill to join his sergeant. Jackson continued staring at the scene below for a long moment before responding. "Maybe not today, maybe not even in our lifetime, but someday the full story will be told. Truth has a way of eventually coming to light." What Jackson could not have known was how prophetic his words would prove, and how the next phase of their mission would bring them face to face with the Japanese officers whose codes they had been breaking, in a confrontation that would shock both sides and change the course of the intelligence war in the Pacific. February 2, 1944. Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands, 14:30 hours. A concrete bunker that once served as a Japanese communications center now lay half destroyed, its eastern wall shattered by naval gunfire. Inside, Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes of Naval Intelligence crouched over a metal desk, hurriedly examining captured documents while the sounds of sporadic gunfire echoed from elsewhere on the island. Outside, Sergeant Howard Jackson and Corporal Elijah Freeman stood guard, their rifles ready, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of Japanese counterattack. Neither man could have predicted how the documents in that bunker would transform their role in the Pacific War and lead to a direct confrontation that would shake the foundations of Japanese military intelligence. The Marshall Islands campaign marked a significant escalation in the Allied offensive against Japan. Unlike the Solomon Islands, where Americans had fought primarily to blunt Japanese expansion, the Marshalls represented the first penetration of Japan's pre-war territory in the Central Pacific. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For Americans, it signaled that the tide had definitively turned. For the Japanese, it was the first tangible evidence that their inner defensive perimeter was vulnerable. For Jackson's team, now officially redesignated as the Pacific Intelligence Unit, PIU, the Marshall's operation presented new challenges. Japanese forces, increasingly aware that their communications were being compromised, had begun implementing more sophisticated encryption systems and changing codes more frequently. This evolution demanded that Jackson's linguists adapt quickly, developing new techniques to identify patterns and exploit weaknesses in the enemy's communication security. "They're learning," Jackson observed during a planning session before the Kwajalein landing. "We need to stay ahead of them." The unit had expanded to 12 men, divided into 3 teams to support different elements of the invasion force. Jackson's team was assigned to support the 4th Marine Division landing on Roi Namur, the northernmost islands of Kwajalein Atoll, while the other teams would operate with Army forces landing on the southern islands. For this operation, their mission parameters had been broadened significantly. In addition to providing real-time intelligence through radio interception, they were tasked with locating and securing any Japanese communication centers and capturing codebooks, encryption devices, or other intelligence materials. The battle for Roi Namur proved unexpectedly brief. Extensive pre-invasion bombardment had devastated Japanese defenses, and organized resistance collapsed within 24 hours of the Marine landing on February 1st. This rapid success created an opportunity for Jackson's team to focus on their intelligence collection objectives. On the afternoon of February 2nd, Marine combat engineers discovered an intact bunker that appeared to have served as a communications center. Jackson's team was immediately called forward to investigate. "Everything's still here," Lieutenant Commander Hayes marveled as they entered the facility. "They must have been overrun before they could destroy anything." The bunker contained a treasure trove of intelligence materials, codebooks, encryption tables, radio equipment, and stacks of message logs. Most significantly, they discovered what appeared to be a new encryption device, a mechanical system similar in concept to the German Enigma machine, but with distinctly Japanese engineering. "This is beyond anything we've seen before," Jackson said, as he carefully examined the device. "This explains why some of their recent transmissions have been unreadable to us." As they were preparing to transport the captured materials to the command ship offshore, Jackson noticed something unusual in one of the message logs, a series of entries flagged with a special designation that didn't match any classification system they had previously encountered. These messages all reference something called Fuyu Sakura, winter cherry blossom, he told Hayes, translating the Japanese characters, and they're all directed to or from Saipan. Hayes frowned. "Saipan is likely our next major objective. These could be related to their defensive preparations." "There's something else," Jackson added, continuing to translate the entries. "They repeatedly mention Code Group 7 and top priority censorship. Whatever this is, they're being extremely secretive about it." The discovery prompted Hayes to request permission to divert Jackson's team from their planned reassignment. Instead of moving on with the 4th Marine Division, they would return to Pearl Harbor with the captured materials to work with naval intelligence on breaking the new encryption system and determining the significance of the Fuyu Sakura communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, personally approved the reassignment after being briefed on the potential intelligence value. "If there's something special about Saipan that we don't know yet, I want to find out before we send our boys in there," he reportedly told his staff. The team's arrival at the intelligence section in Pearl Harbor on February 15, 1944, marked a significant milestone. For the first time, they would be working directly alongside white intelligence officers and cryptanalysts in a relatively integrated environment. While segregation remained the norm throughout most military facilities, the specialized nature of intelligence work and the obvious value of Jackson's team created a small island of meritocracy within the larger sea of discrimination. Commander James Forrester, head of the Pacific Fleet's code-breaking section, initially viewed the arrival of black Marines with skepticism. His concerns were practical rather than racial. He worried about disrupting the efficient operation of his unit by introducing personnel with unknown capabilities. "I understand you've had field experience with Japanese communications," he said during his first meeting with Jackson, his tone suggesting that field experience might be considerably less valuable than formal cryptanalytic training. "Yes, sir," Jackson replied evenly. "My team has been intercepting, translating, and exploiting Japanese military communications in combat zones for the past 18 months. Translating is not the same as breaking encryption," Forrester noted. "No, sir, but we've been doing that too," Jackson said, then gestured to the captured encryption device they had brought from Kwajalein. "Though this system is new to us, we're eager to learn how it works." Forrester's skepticism began to fade over the following days as he observed the team at work. Jackson and his men demonstrated not only their linguistic abilities, but also their analytical skills and intuitive understanding of Japanese military communication patterns. By the end of the first week, Forrester had assigned Jackson's team full responsibility for analyzing the Fuyu Sakura communications. Working in shifts around the clock, they gradually pieced together the significance of the mysterious reference. Fuyu Sakura appeared to be a code name for a high-level Japanese naval officer who had been dispatched to Saipan with a special assignment related to communication security. "I think they've sent one of their top cryptography experts to revamp their entire Pacific code system," Jackson explained during a briefing on February 28th. These messages repeatedly emphasize the need to eliminate vulnerabilities and restore communication security. They know they've been compromised, and they're taking serious steps to fix it. Further analysis revealed that the officer in question was likely Captain Takashi Maebara, former head of the Imperial Navy's Communications School and a recognized expert in cryptography. If he succeeded in implementing a genuinely secure encryption system throughout the Japanese Pacific forces, the intelligence advantage that American forces had enjoyed would be significantly reduced. "How much time do we have?" Forrester asked. "Based on these communications, he arrived on Saipan in late January," Jackson replied. "He's been tasked with completing the implementation of new protocols before the cherry blossom season, so sometime in April, most likely." "Then we need to be on Saipan before April," Forrester concluded. "We need to capture Maebara or his materials before he can fully deploy this new system." The strategic implications were immediately apparent. While Saipan had already been identified as a critical target in the American island-hopping campaign, the intelligence about Maebara's activities added new urgency. Admiral Nimitz and his planning staff accelerated preparations for Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, with Saipan as the primary objective. For Jackson and his team, the mission now became even more critical. They would not only support the invasion through their usual intelligence functions, but would also be tasked with locating and capturing Captain Maebara and any materials related to the new encryption system. As preparations for the Saipan operation intensified through March and April, Jackson's team underwent additional training in special operations techniques. They would potentially need to operate behind enemy lines, identify specific targets based on limited information, and secure sensitive materials while under fire. During this period, their status within the Navy's intelligence community continued to evolve. The clear value of their contributions had earned them a level of professional respect that transcended the racial prejudices of the era, at least within the confined world of signals intelligence. Yet they remained acutely aware that this bubble of relative equality existed only because of wartime necessity and the classified nature of their work. "Don't get used to this," Private Carter cautioned when Freeman remarked on the relatively equal treatment they were receiving. "Once the war ends, they'll put us right back where they think we belong." "Maybe," Jackson responded. "Or maybe what we're doing here will help change things. Not immediately, not completely, but it's a crack in the wall." As D-Day for Saipan approached, the team was briefed on what little was known about Maebara's location and activities on the island. Intelligence suggested he was operating from a communication center in the hills near Garapan, the main settlement on Saipan's western coast. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed a compound protected by anti-aircraft guns and surrounded by defensive positions, clearly a facility of significant importance. "Your primary mission is to secure any cryptographic materials and, if possible, capture Maebara himself," Commander Forrester told them during their final briefing. "We need to know exactly what changes he's implemented and how widely they've been deployed." The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on the southwestern beaches, encountering fierce Japanese resistance. Unlike previous island battles where Japanese forces had primarily defended from fixed positions, on Saipan they counterattacked aggressively, making the establishment of a secure beachhead more difficult and costly. Jackson's team came ashore on the second day with a security detail of 8 Marines commanded by Lieutenant William Harrison, a combat veteran who had been briefed on the importance of their mission. Their immediate objective was to establish a forward listening post to monitor Japanese communications and attempt to locate Maebara's precise position. Most of the Japanese communications are focused on the tactical situation, Jackson reported after their first day of monitoring. But we've intercepted 2 messages referencing special materials being moved from Garapan to a fallback position in the island's interior. Based on the encryption pattern, these almost certainly relate to Maebara's operation. By June 19th, as Marines pushed inland against determined resistance, Jackson's team had triangulated the probable location of Maebara's new position, a complex of caves in the mountainous center of the island. With Japanese forces being steadily pushed back, there was concern that Maebara might destroy his materials or attempt evacuation from the island. Lieutenant Harrison assembled a 15-man patrol, including Jackson's 5-man team, to penetrate beyond the front lines and attempt to reach the cave complex before the Japanese could relocate or destroy the cryptographic materials. Moving out before dawn on June 20th, they used ravines and dense vegetation to infiltrate nearly 2 miles beyond the American front lines. As they approached the target area, they began to encounter small groups of Japanese soldiers retreating toward the island's northern end. Twice they were forced to take cover as larger enemy units passed nearby, but their familiarity with Japanese communication protocols proved invaluable. By monitoring portable radio traffic, they could anticipate enemy movements and avoid detection. Shortly after noon, they reached a vantage point overlooking a narrow valley where several cave entrances were visible on the opposing slope. Activity around the caves confirmed they had reached their objective. Japanese communications personnel could be seen moving equipment between the caves, and a small generator provided power for radio equipment. "There," Jackson said quietly, pointing to a figure emerging from the largest cave entrance. "The officer with the naval cap and glasses. That matches Maebara's description." The Japanese captain was directing the activity, clearly supervising the packing and transport of equipment. The urgency of the operation suggested they were preparing to evacuate to another location, possibly in response to the rapid American advance. Lieutenant Harrison assessed the situation quickly. "We need to move now before they relocate. Jackson, your team will focus on securing any documents or equipment. My men will handle the Japanese personnel." The attack, when it came, achieved complete surprise. Harrison's Marines opened fire from multiple positions, creating the impression of a much larger American force. Several Japanese communications personnel were killed in the initial volley, while others retreated into the caves or sought cover among the rocks. Jackson led his team directly toward the main cave entrance, where Maebara had disappeared inside moments before the attack began. As they approached, 2 Japanese soldiers emerged firing, but were quickly neutralized by the covering Marines. Inside the cave, they found a fully equipped communication center in the process of being dismantled. Maps, codebooks, and stacks of message logs were being packed into metal containers. And there, standing beside a table covered with technical diagrams, was Captain Takashi Maebara. The Japanese officer turned to face them, his expression shifting from surprise to a strange, resigned recognition. He made no move toward the pistol holstered at his side. "Surrender immediately," Jackson ordered in Japanese, his rifle trained on the captain. Maebara stared at him in astonishment, clearly shocked at being addressed in fluent Japanese by a black American Marine. "You speak Japanese?" he asked, switching to English with a heavy accent. "Yes," Jackson replied, continuing in Japanese. "We understand your codes as well." Maebara's face registered a complex series of emotions: surprise, disbelief, and finally a bitter understanding. "Impossible," he murmured. "Our codes are based on cultural concepts no Westerner could comprehend." "That was your mistake," Jackson said, gesturing for one of his men to secure the captain. "You underestimated us." As Corporal Freeman began collecting the documents from the table, Maebara continued staring at Jackson with a mixture of curiosity and dismay. "You are American, but not." "Typical American," he said, struggling with his English. "How did you learn Japanese language, Japanese thinking?" "We studied," Jackson replied simply. "Just as you would study any opponent you wanted to defeat." The exchange was cut short as Lieutenant Harrison entered the cave. "Area secured," he reported. "We've taken 4 prisoners and eliminated approximately 12 enemy personnel. No casualties on our side." Over the next 30 minutes, Jackson's team worked methodically to gather all materials related to the Japanese encryption systems. They found not only codebooks and cipher tables, but also technical diagrams for the new encryption device, and most valuable of all, Maebara's personal journals detailing the weaknesses he had identified in previous systems and the solutions he had implemented. "This is everything we hope to find and more," Jackson told Harrison as they prepared to withdraw. "With these materials, we'll be able to counter any changes they've made to their encryption and maintain our intelligence advantage." The return journey to American lines was tense but uneventful. By nightfall, Jackson's team, along with Lieutenant Harrison's Marines, had returned safely with their prisoners and the captured materials. Captain Maebara, though initially reluctant to speak, eventually engaged in limited conversation with Jackson during the journey. "You understand that my new codes would have changed the course of many battles," the Japanese officer said at one point. "Yes," Jackson acknowledged. "That's why we needed to stop you." Maebara nodded slowly. "You were educated in Japan?" "No. Howard University in Washington, D.C. The captain's brow furrowed in confusion. "But how then? Our codes incorporate classical poetry, historical references, cultural concepts." "Which can all be learned," Jackson explained. "The same way I learned your language." After a long silence, Maebara said something that would later be included in intelligence reports all the way up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "We were told Americans could never understand Japanese minds, especially your kind. This was fundamental to our communication security strategy. If I had not seen this myself, I would not have believed it possible." The materials captured in the raid proved to be of extraordinary value. Maebara had indeed been developing a significantly more sophisticated encryption system, incorporating elements of classical Japanese literature and historical references that would have been extremely difficult to break without the detailed documentation now in American hands. More importantly, the captain's notes revealed the extent to which Japanese communication security had relied on the assumption that Western minds, and particularly those of non-white Americans, could not possibly comprehend the cultural nuances embedded in their codes. Their entire approach to communication security was built on a foundation of cultural and racial supremacy, Jackson explained in his report. They believed certain aspects of Japanese language and culture were impenetrable to outsiders, especially those they considered racially inferior. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a strategic vulnerability that we were able to exploit. The immediate impact of the captured materials was significant. Armed with Maebara's documentation, American cryptanalysts could now read even the most recent Japanese naval communications with relative ease. This intelligence advantage proved crucial in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which unfolded in the waters west of the Marianas from June 19 to 20, resulting in such a decisive American victory that it became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Captain Maebara, capture meant the end of his role in the war. As a high-value intelligence prisoner, he was quickly transferred to a specialized interrogation facility in Hawaii, where he continued to provide insights into Japanese communication systems, though his cooperation appeared to stem more from professional respect for his captor's demonstrated capabilities than from any disloyalty to Japan. Jackson's team, meanwhile, found themselves the subject of unprecedented recognition. Admiral Nimitz personally commended them for the success of their mission, acknowledging that the intelligence they had secured would save countless American lives in the continuing campaign against Japan. "Your actions represent the highest traditions of the naval service," Nimitz told Jackson during a private meeting at Pearl Harbor in July 1944. "I've recommended all of you for the Silver Star." The Admiral's recommendation faced resistance at higher levels, however. While the value of the team's contribution was unquestioned, there remained significant institutional reluctance to award such prominent decorations to black servicemen. "The concern isn't about whether they deserve it," wrote one staff officer at Pacific Fleet headquarters in a memo that later became part of the historical record. "The question is the precedent it would establish and the potential impact on morale and discipline in other colored units. If they see this as a change in policy, regarding appropriate roles and recognition. This internal debate highlighted the contradictions inherent in America's segregated military. The same men whose intelligence and courage had been pivotal in securing victory were still subject to limitations based solely on their race. Colonel Thompson, who had created the program and continued to advocate for his men, argued forcefully against these objections. If we judge these Marines worthy of undertaking missions of the highest importance and risk, how can we then judge them unworthy of receiving the appropriate recognition for their success? He wrote in response to the concerns raised. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. The men would receive their Silver Stars, but the citations would describe their actions in deliberately vague terms as exceptional service in support of combat operations. The classified nature of their actual role would provide cover for this unusual recognition of Black Marines. The award ceremony, held at Pearl Harbor on August 15, 1944, was a subdued affair with minimal publicity. Photographs were restricted, and no press was permitted to attend. For the men themselves, the recognition was meaningful but bittersweet. "They want our service but not our stories," Private Carter observed afterward. "They'll pin medals on our chests behind closed doors, then send us back to segregated barracks." For Sergeant Jackson, however, the experience reinforced his belief that their service was creating small but significant changes. "Today we're an exception," he told his men, "but exceptions have a way of becoming precedents, and precedents eventually become normal. What we're doing here will matter long after this war ends." Following the Saipan operation, the unit's role continued to evolve. As the American advance moved inexorably closer to the Japanese home islands, the focus shifted from tactical intelligence to strategic insights. Jackson's team, now expanded to 20 men in 4 separate groups, worked increasingly on analyzing high-level Japanese communications regarding homeland defense preparations and potential peace initiatives. By early 1945, as American forces secured Iwo Jima and prepared for the invasion of Okinawa, the team's linguistic expertise had become particularly valuable in assessing civilian communications from within Japan itself. Increasing air raids on Japanese cities were creating a growing refugee crisis, and intercepted messages between government agencies revealed the deteriorating conditions and declining morale on the home front. "They're starting to realize they can't win," Jackson reported after analyzing a series of communications between Imperial headquarters and regional military districts in March 1945. "But their cultural concept of honor makes surrender almost unthinkable. They're preparing their population for a final defense of the home islands, regardless of the cost." This assessment proved prescient as the battle for Okinawa unfolded from April through June 1945, demonstrating the Japanese military's willingness to fight to near total destruction rather than surrender. The ferocity of this resistance and the enormous casualties on both sides reinforced the daunting prospects of an invasion of Japan itself. It was during the Okinawa campaign that Jackson had his final significant encounter with Captain Mabara. The Japanese officer, still in American custody, but now assisting with analysis of Japanese communications, requested a meeting after learning that Jackson was at the same facility on temporary assignment. The two men met in a small conference room at the intelligence center, each regarding the other with a complex mixture of professional respect and awareness of their fundamental opposition. "Your forces will soon be considering an invasion of our home islands," Mabara said after they had exchanged formal greetings. "That seems likely," Jackson acknowledged, careful not to confirm any specific plans. "You should understand something," the captain continued. "What you witnessed on Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, this is only a fraction of the resistance you will face in Japan itself. Our people will fight with whatever they have, down to bamboo spears. Millions will die on both sides." "Is there an alternative?" Jackson asked. "Would your leaders consider surrender?" Mabara was silent for a long moment before responding. "Our military code does not recognize surrender as an option. Death before dishonor is not merely a saying for us, it is a fundamental belief." "Even if it means the destruction of Japan itself?" "Even then," Mabara confirmed grimly. "Unless what?" Jackson pressed when the captain hesitated. Unless there was some way for the Japanese people to believe that surrender was not dishonorable, that it represented a different kind of courage in service to the emperor and the nation's future. This conversation, which Jackson dutifully reported to his superiors, reflected similar assessments emerging from other intelligence sources. Japan's military culture made conventional surrender unlikely, regardless of the strategic situation. This understanding contributed to the complex calculations that would ultimately lead to the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. When news of Japan's surrender reached Jackson and his team on August 15, 1945, their reactions were mixed. There was relief that the war had ended, without the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands, satisfaction in having contributed to the Allied victory, and uncertainty about what peace would mean for their own futures in a still segregated America. "We helped win this war," Private First Class Morris observed as they listened to President Truman's announcement of Japan's surrender. "But we're still going to ride in the back of the bus when we get home." "Maybe," Jackson replied, "but we've proven something important to ourselves and to anyone who knows what we did here, and that knowledge can't be taken away from us." In the immediate aftermath of the war, the special intelligence units were quickly disbanded. Most of the men returned to civilian life, their service classified, and their contributions largely unacknowledged in the official histories of the conflict. Jackson himself remained in the Marine Corps until 1949, when he resigned his commission to pursue graduate studies in international relations. The Japanese officers whose codes had been broken and whose cultural assumptions had been so thoroughly exposed generally remained unaware of the full extent of American code-breaking success. Captain Maibara, repatriated to Japan in 1946, was one of the few who understood how completely their communication security had been compromised. In a memoir published shortly before his death in 1968, Maibara wrote, "Our greatest strategic error was not technological but cultural. We believed our language and thought patterns were impenetrable to outsiders, especially those we considered inferior. This belief was so fundamental that we never seriously questioned it. And that unquestioned assumption cost us dearly in intelligence security." For Howard Jackson and the other black Marines who had served in the Special Intelligence Units, the post-war years brought both opportunities and continued challenges. Many used the GI Bill to pursue higher education, entering professions that had previously been largely closed to black Americans. Their wartime experience with complex linguistic and analytical work had prepared them for success in fields ranging from education to business to government service. Yet the full story of their wartime contributions remained classified for decades. It was not until the 1970s that the first academic studies began to acknowledge the role of black servicemen in specialized intelligence operations during World War II, and even then, many details remained obscured by continuing classification restrictions. Jackson himself went on to a distinguished career in academia, eventually becoming a professor of international relations at Howard University, the same institution where he had studied linguistics before the war. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, honoring both the classified nature of his work and the complex emotions associated with serving a country that had not yet recognized his full citizenship. In a rare interview granted to a doctoral student researching minority contributions to the war effort in 1972, Jackson reflected on the paradox of his service. "We were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the foreign enemies of freedom and another against the barriers to freedom within our own society. The first war ended in 1945. The second continues to this day." The last significant recognition of the black Marine linguists came in 1992, when a historical review by the Department of Defense led to the award of Presidential Unit citations to several previously unrecognized intelligence units, including the original Thompson Scholars. By then, many of the men had passed away, including Howard Jackson, who died in 1987, without witnessing this belated acknowledgement of their service. The story of how Japanese officers were shocked to discover that black American Marines understood their military codes remains one of the less known but most revealing episodes of World War II, a testament to the fallibility of cultural arrogance and the capabilities of men who served with distinction, despite the barriers placed before them. On that February afternoon in 1944, when Captain Maebara stared in disbelief at Sergeant Howard Jackson speaking fluent Japanese in a cave on Saipan, two systems of racial prejudice, American and Japanese, collided with reality. In that moment of recognition, both systems were exposed as the hollow fabrications they had always been. After the war, a journalist asked Jackson if he felt bitter about the limited recognition of his unit's contributions. His response revealed much about the man and the perspective he had gained through his extraordinary wartime experiences. "We didn't serve for recognition. We served because our country needed what we could provide, our minds, our courage, our willingness to risk everything. The fact that we did so despite the barriers placed before us doesn't diminish our service. It elevates it." Today, the full story of the Black Marine linguists exists as more than just a footnote in military history. It stands as a powerful reminder that human potential cannot be contained by arbitrary barriers of race or prejudice, and that in the crucible of war, it was not just weapons and numbers that secured Allied victory, but also the intelligence, courage and dedication of men who served despite being denied the full rights of the citizenship they were defending. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.